Today we have a Sigma. It's been a while since I last saw one of these. Sigma represents an interesting piece of Martin guitar history. In much the same way that Gibson decided it needed to compete with Asian-made instruments by selling an Asian-made instrument and moving its Epiphone production to Japan, Martin at the beginning of the 1970s realized they were facing a bit of a crisis. Sales had been good. They'd been riding the crest of the folk and the folk rock boom for the past decade. It had become very popular. It had given them the opportunity to expand their operation, and they bought a great big new factory. However, that expansion cost a lot of money, and when Frank Martin took over as president in 1970, there was a realization that Japanese import guitars were set to take a huge bite out of the market. There were loans to pay, and Frank went on a bit of a buying spree, trying to absorb smaller makers, sometimes in foreign countries, to try and diversify the kind of product that Martin had under its belt, and basically leverage the company credit in an effort to grow big enough, fast enough to outpace the costs. Seem risky? Yeah. It eventually brought Martin close to bankruptcy. One strategy hinged on the realization that they needed something to offer the beginner segment of the market. They needed to move cheap guitars in order to keep the US operation afloat. That's not an easy thing for a company who has the reputation of being the ultimate in American craftsmanship, right? How do you maneuver? Because you don't want to compete with your own lower-end models, and the product has to be good, but not too good, and yet still have some of that Martin cachet. And so enter Sigma. The year's 1970. The initial lineup was very Japanese. They were made in a number of different factories, Tokai Gakki being probably the big one. The guitars had 0 frets. They had adjustable saddles, sort of like a Gibson. Adjustable truss rods, too, that were accessible at the headstock, like a Gibson. That's 15 years before Martin adopted an adjustable rod. They were made of laminated materials, including the tops, and in many ways they're similar to your average Yamaha of the period. They're essentially square-shoulder Gibson-like guitars that the Japanese makers had been producing for, well, most of the latter half of the 60s. Sort of like, they were doing a lot of Hummingbird clones and that kind of thing. But they put a label inside that said, produced and distributed by C.F. Martin of Nazareth, Pennsylvania, which is kind of cheeky, but it worked. A few years later they opened the books and they realized, these are doing pretty well. And these Japanese factories are capable of doing some really high quality work at a very low price. Why don't we make some with solid spruce tops and see what happens? And yes, they sold very well. They also came out with some other instruments, some Sigma branded electric guitars that I think were mostly sold in Europe, because at that point Martin had acquired the Swedish company Levin. We've talked about them before. I've done some repairs on some Levins. So they made some inroads into the European market. Finally, in the late 70s and early 80s, they did a redesign and the guitars became true clones. No more headstock adjustable truss rod, no more adjustable saddle. They were essentially laminated body Martins with solid tops made away from home. And in fact, quality control was so good that for the upper end of the line, they would ship the parts to Pennsylvania, and they were assembled in-house by Martin workers so that they could advertise that they were made in the USA. The company was really clutching at straws by that point. It's hard to overstate just how close to the wrecking ball Martin actually came. By 1983, they decided to cut costs even more and move production to Korea, where they continued to make a lot of guitars, but those aren't generally perceived to be in the same category as the Japanese ones. Then in the 90s, they moved it on again to Taiwan and Indonesia, and they stopped really promoting them as heavily. You couldn't see them in the Martin catalog anymore. By 2006, they closed down the brand, so they're now unavailable. This is one of the clones from that late period of Japanese manufacture. Really nice guitar, and there's not too much wrong with it. It's in for a partial refret because it's had a lot of play, and it needs a setup. The action is getting a little bit high. This is a DR35, which is in line with the American model, the D35. And yeah, I'm pretty impressed. Relief in the neck is around 12 thousandths, which is a little bit high. The action height is getting up there. It's 9/64 on the bass side and around 7 on the treble. There's some pretty significant divots happening in the first position, especially around the B string there. So deep, in fact, that I don't think it's worthwhile trying to level and recrown these. There's just not enough fret height left. So we're going to remove those and replace them. The first thing I'm going to do is adjust the truss rod and see if we can straighten that neck a little bit. See what happens. So this is a rod that's accessible through the first transverse brace here, and it seems to be a 5mm Allen key. So I'm going to give it that much. I'll gently massage the neck back and forth a little bit just to make sure the rod isn't hanging up in any place. Get my capo, pop that on the first fret. My feeler gauges, tip the guitar up, press down around the body joint, and measure at the 6th fret. Okay, so we're looking at around 6/1000ths, which is much better. This is a time I like to use the notch straight edge as well, just to see what's going on at the actual surface of the board. Fairly straight. The main focus of relief does appear to be 7, 8, 9 in that area, which is okay. And with the truss rod adjustment, the action has come down about a 1/64 of an inch. Now it's sitting at 8/64 bass and just over 6 on the treble. It's moving in the right direction. I need to measure these frets for size. Got the old dial caliper here, and about 80/1000ths by probably 40. Yeah, so pretty standard wire. I have that on hand. When I say they cared about the details, they even made the saddle bottoms slanted to the angle of the headstock like on real Martins. That's pretty good. Do a light little score along the sides of each fret, kind of angling inwards. This helps prevent chipping from extending out into the board, because there are little barbs on the tang of the fret wire which are just about as wide as the fret is, and we pull those up, they tend to cause some splintering, and in some cases, if someone's really rough, they'll tear out great big chunks of fretboard. But this helps prevent that. Looking at the state of fret number 5, I think I'm going to do the first 5 frets.
Yeah, my shirt is all covered in sawdust. I'm working on some other projects that involve a bunch of woodworking, which you'll be seeing in the next few weeks, some big videos. So I heated the fret up and now I'm pulling it out with my fret pulling nippers. These have been specially ground for the purpose with very thin jaws that get under the head of the fret and lift it directly up. The main thing, of course, is to be patient and let it come up of its own accord and try not to rip it out. So I give it a little wiggle, and the result is nice. Not very much damage at all. Because this is a partial refret, there isn't much opportunity to dress the surface of the board. It's going to retain this character. However, these divots look a little worse than they actually are, because I've noticed it seems to have been treated with one of those products designed to darken the wood. It's like a colored wax, perhaps. There are a number of them on the market now for people who want to relic their own boards. It wiped right off when I took the schmutz off with some naphtha. On bound refrets like this, it's important to keep the little landing pads that were right under the ends of the frets. These aren't the Gibson nibs, they're flat spots. If we round those off to match the rest of the neck, there'd be no support under the fret there. There'd be a little gap on the ends, which hurts your fingers and is difficult to conceal. This little tool from StewMac helps to see if the slots will be deep enough to accept the wire I'll be using. And there's plenty of room in there. This is my fret roller. It forces the wire into a radius to match the curve on the fretboard. I'll cut each fret to length, leaving them just a little bit over long. Then I'll cut away some of the tang to allow the crown to overhang the binding, with a little bit of a notch on both ends. The tang nipper always leaves a little bit of material on the underside of the fret that needs to be removed, in my case by filing. If this is neglected, it will appear on the end of the finished fret, and it can be quite unsightly. So we'll dress that off. I'm one of those people who likes to use a little bit of protein-based glue in the fret slots. In this case, fish glue. I'll get the fret into position so that the overhang on the binding is equal on both sides. Give it a couple of taps with the hammer just to get it started. Then grab my fret jaw pusher plier things and give it a squeeze to seat it. I'll clean off any squeeze out with a lightly dampened paper towel and then move on to the next one. Leveling the fret tops took very little effort. Just a quick pass. I'll use the 3-corner file with safe edges to just roll over the top of the crown of the fret, re-establish it into a perfect little arc. I had darkened the fret tops with marker, and you can see I've left a very thin little line of it right down the center of the fret, which will get dressed off with sandpaper. Some 600 grit paper stroked lightly in the direction of the frets will remove the little scratches left over from the leveling. And then it's on to polishing. Using a small safe edge file, I'll knock off the corners of the frets where they meet the binding. And then round over the corners using an arcing motion. The fret ends also get buffed up with some micro mesh, backed with a small wooden block. This profile matches what was on the rest of the frets. It's very comfortable. A little lemon oil will redarken the divots and won't interfere if the owner wants to use the fingerboard preparation again. I don't believe this saddle has ever been lowered. There's more than 1/8 of an inch or 3.1 millimeters still exposed, which lets us take some off to lower the action. As I'm removing a full 32nd of an inch, I'm being pretty aggressive here. As I get close to final height, I'll slow down and start checking with a square and straight edge to make sure I'm keeping the base true. The screw-in bushings have become loose on all the tuner posts. Those need to get tightened down, or they can be the cause of some mysterious buzzes. Before we put the strings back on, let's have a quick look inside. This is very typical of 1970s Martin bracing with a few little twists. The end block is kind of small. It's pretty diminutive. We're well past the era of scalloped bracing, of course, but these seem maybe a little bit lighter than some mid-70s US-made guitars I've worked on. One odd thing is a little tiny piece of cross-grain reinforcement that's positioned on the center seam between the rosewood bridge pad and the upper tone bar. I've never seen that before. I'm not sure what the thinking is there. But on the whole, pretty clean work. All set to go. Still have decent saddle height. There was a 30% decrease in action height. Now it's 6/64 on the bass, 5 on the treble. Very satisfying guitar to play. I'm a fan.